Men, when was the last time you cried? My number one dream in life was always to be a dad, and when my daughter Isabella was born 5 years ago, I remember holding her in the hospital and thinking that nothing bad could ever touch us as long as I was there to protect her. I was naive in the way that new parents often are, believing that love alone could shield us from the things that were already coming. My wife started struggling a few months after we brought Isabella home, not in dramatic ways at first, just a tiredness that wouldn't lift, a distance in her eyes when she looked at our daughter, a flatness in her voice when she said she was fine. The doctors called it postpartum depression and gave her medication and told us it would get better, and I believed them because I needed to believe something. But it didn't get better. It got worse, slowly, and then all at once, until my wife was someone I didn't recognize anymore, crying for hours, then screaming at me for small things, then going silent for days in a way that scared me more than the screaming. She never hurt Isabella, not physically, but there were moments when I'd come home and find our daughter in her crib with a soaked diaper and my wife just sitting in the dark living room staring at nothing, and I'd feel this cold fear that I couldn't name. I started taking over everything, the feedings, the diaper changes, the bedtime routines, telling myself I was helping, but really, I was building a wall between my wife and my daughter because I didn't trust what might happen if I wasn't there. My wife knew what I was doing and it made everything worse. She'd accuse me of thinking she was a bad mother, and I'd deny it even though we both knew I was lying, and the arguments got louder and more frequent, until Isabella learned to go quiet whenever our voices rose, which broke something in me I don't think will ever fully heal. We separated when Isabella was 18 months old, and my wife checked herself into a treatment facility, and I told myself this was the right thing, even as I watched her drive away and wondered if I'd failed her somehow. The custody arrangement gave me primary placement, and my wife got supervised visits, and for a while that's how it was, me and Isabella in a small apartment, learning how to be a family of two, while my wife worked on getting better somewhere I couldn't help her. Those early years were hard in ways I don't talk about much. I was exhausted all the time, working and parenting and worrying, and some nights I'd put Isabella to bed and then sit in the kitchen and just stare at the wall because I didn't have the energy to do anything else. But Isabella grew, the way children do whether you're ready or not, and slowly she went from a quiet, watchful toddler to a girl who laughed easily and demanded bedtime stories and told me I was her best friend in the whole world. I cried the first time she said that, and she looked at me with this serious expression and asked why I was sad, and I told her I wasn't sad. I was just so happy it came out as tears, and she nodded like that made perfect sense. My wife got better too, eventually. Not cured, because that's not how mental illness works, but stable enough to have unsupervised visits, stable enough to be part of Isabella's life in a way that I had to make peace with, even when it scared me. Last month she told me she wants to revisit the custody arrangement, and I don't know yet what that will look like or how I feel about it. Part of me wants to fight, to protect what Isabella and I have built together, and part of me knows that a daughter needs her mother, and that keeping them apart might hurt Isabella in ways I can't see yet. I don't have an answer, and I've stopped pretending that I will. What I do know is that last week Isabella drew me a picture of the two of us as stick figures holding hands, with "Best Dad Ever" written on top in wobbly letters, and I put it on the refrigerator where I can see it every morning. She asked me if I liked it, and I told her it was the best gift I'd ever received, and she beamed at me with her mother's eyes, and I felt everything at once. The fear and the love and the grief and the hope all tangled together in a knot I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to untangle. I don't know what comes next for us. I don't know if my wife will stay well, or if the custody battle will tear apart the fragile peace we've built. I just know that every night I tuck my daughter in and tell her I love her, and every morning she wakes up and knows that someone in this world will always be there for her, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can really promise. The morning after my ex-wife texted me about wanting to talk about custody, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold in my hands, while Isabella ate her cereal across from me. She was humming some song from a cartoon and swinging her legs under the chair, completely unaware that my stomach was twisted into knots. The stick figure drawing was right there on the refrigerator where I'd put it, and I kept looking at it while trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. My phone rang, and I saw it was Evan, my brother, doing his usual Sunday morning check-in. I answered and tried to sound normal, but he knew me too well for that. He asked what was wrong, and I found myself telling him about the text message before I'd even really thought through what it meant. I told him my ex-wife wanted to revisit the custody arrangement and that I didn't know how to respond or what to say. Evan listened without interrupting, which is what he always does when he knows I need to talk something through. When I finished, there was a pause, and then he asked me something I wasn't ready for. He said, the question hit me like a punch, because I realized I'd been so busy trying to protect her that I hadn't asked her anything. I'd been making all these decisions based on fear from 5 years ago, and I hadn't considered what she might need now. After I hung up with Evan, I sat there watching Isabella finish her cereal and felt like I was failing her in a completely different way than I'd been worried about. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what Evan had said. I put Isabella to bed each night and then sat in the living room with my laptop, searching for information about custody modifications and family mediation. The legal language was confusing and overwhelming, full of terms I didn't understand and processes that seemed designed to make everything harder. I read through dozens of websites, trying to figure out what my ex-wife might be asking for and what my options were. Most of the sites talked about what was best for the child, which made sense, but it also scared me because I wasn't sure anymore what that actually meant. On the third night, I found a mediator's website that felt different from the others. Her name was Lana Nolan, and her site emphasized helping families find solutions that put kids first, instead of just fighting in court. I read through her approach and her background, and something about the way she described the process made it feel less scary. Before I could talk myself out of it, I sent her an email explaining my situation and asking if she could help. I hit send and then closed my laptop and sat in the dark apartment, wondering if I'd just made everything more real by reaching out. 2 days later, my ex-wife called me. I saw her name on my phone, and my heart started racing before I even answered. We hadn't had a real phone conversation in months, just quick texts about pickup times and doctor appointments. I picked up and said hello, and there was this awkward silence before she started talking. She told me she knew this was hard and that she appreciated me being willing to discuss it. Then she explained that she'd been stable for 3 years now, going to therapy every week and taking her medication without missing a day. She said she had a steady job at a dental office doing billing and scheduling, and that she'd been working on herself and proving she could be reliable. Her voice got quieter when she said she wanted to be more than just supervised visits in Isabella's life. She wanted to be able to have bedtime routines and help with homework and be there for the ordinary moments that make up being a parent. I heard the longing in her voice when she talked about missing those things, and it made me uncomfortable because I'd been trying not to think about what she might be feeling. We talked for maybe 20 minutes, and the whole time I kept thinking about the person she used to be, the one who scared me so much. But the person on the phone sounded different, calmer and more present, and I didn't know how to match those two versions of her in my head. That night during Isabella's bedtime routine, I was tucking her in when she looked up at me with those serious eyes she gets sometimes. She asked me why mommy only visits sometimes and not all the time like other kids' mommies do. I felt my chest tighten because I'd been avoiding this conversation for years. I told her it was complicated, which is what I always say, but she kept looking at me and said she wished it wasn't so complicated. She said she loved spending time with mommy and wanted to have sleepovers at her house like she does at mine. Something cracked open in my chest when she said that, this feeling that I'd been holding on to control so tightly that I hadn't seen what Isabella actually needed. I kissed her forehead and told her we were working on making things better, and she smiled and hugged her stuffed elephant and closed her eyes. I sat on the edge of her bed for a while after she fell asleep, just watching her breathe and trying to figure out how to be brave enough to let go a little. Lana called me back 3 days after I sent the email. Her voice was calm and professional in a way that somehow made me feel less panicked. We scheduled a time to meet at her office for an initial meeting, and she explained what mediation would involve. She said, custody modifications happen when circumstances change in significant ways, and that courts care about what's best for children, not about parents' fears or old hurts. That sentence stuck with me because it was both comforting and scary at the same time. It meant there were rules and processes, but it also meant my feelings about what happened 5 years ago might not matter as much as I thought they should. Lana asked me some basic questions about the current arrangement and what my ex-wife was requesting, and I told her I wasn't entirely sure yet. She said that was okay, and that part of mediation was helping us figure out what we each wanted and needed. When I hung up, I felt this strange mix of relief and terror, like I'd taken a step towards something I couldn't take back. The next week, I had my regular therapy appointment with Petra. I'd been seeing her for about 2 years, mostly to deal with stress from work and some anxiety stuff. I walked into her office planning to talk about a difficult project at my job, but as soon as I sat down, I found myself talking about the custody request instead. Petra listened and then asked me to get specific about what I was actually afraid of. Not the general fear of losing Isabella or something bad happening, but the real scenarios that kept me up at night. I started listing things and realized as I talked that most of my fears were about situations from 5 years ago. I was afraid of coming home and finding Isabella neglected, but that hadn't happened in years. I was afraid of my ex-wife disappearing into depression again, but she'd been stable for a long time now. Petra pointed out that I was making decisions based on a past that didn't exist anymore, and that maybe I needed to look at who my ex-wife was now instead of who she used to be. That session left me feeling raw and exposed, like I'd been forced to admit things I'd been hiding from myself. The first mediation session was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. I took time off work and drove to Lana's office, which was in a professional building downtown. The waiting room had beige walls and uncomfortable chairs, and I sat there feeling like I was waiting for medical test results that would determine my entire future. My ex-wife arrived a few minutes after me, and I could see her hands shaking as she signed in at the front desk. We nodded at each other but didn't really talk. Lana came out and brought us into a small conference room with a table and 3 chairs. She sat at the head of the table, and we sat across from each other, and I noticed my ex-wife's hands were trembling just like mine were. Lana explained how mediation would work, that we'd each have a chance to share our perspectives, and that her job was to help us find solutions that worked for everyone, especially Isabella. She talked about confidentiality and respect, and focusing on the future instead of the past. The whole time she was explaining, I kept sneaking looks at my ex-wife and seeing someone who looked nervous and hopeful and scared, which was probably exactly how I looked too. Lana asked us each to talk about how we saw the current custody arrangement and what we hoped could change. My ex-wife went first, and I forced myself to actually listen instead of just planning what I would say. She talked about the past 3 years of therapy sessions and medication management and building a stable life for herself. She described her apartment and her job and her daily routines, painting a picture of someone who'd done the hard work of getting better. Then she talked about what she was missing, and her voice got thick with emotion. She said she missed bedtime stories and school pickups and helping with homework. She missed ordinary Tuesday afternoons and Saturday morning pancakes and all the small moments that make up being a parent. As she talked, I realized she was describing exactly the things that had become my entire world, the moments that defined my relationship with Isabella. The thought of sharing those moments made me feel like I was losing something essential, and I didn't know how to separate my fear from what was actually fair. After the mediation session ended, I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time before starting the engine. I kept replaying my ex-wife's words in my head, trying to match them with the memories I'd been carrying around for 5 years. She'd sounded genuine and thoughtful, and she'd cried when talking about missing Isabella's everyday life. I wanted to hold on to my anger and fear because they felt safer than considering that maybe she really had changed. Finally, I pulled out my phone and called Evan. When he answered, I told him I didn't know how to let go of the past enough to see the present clearly. I said I kept seeing the person who scared me instead of the person who was sitting across from me at that conference table. Evan was quiet for a minute, and then he said something that hit hard. He told me that Isabella deserved a mother who was healthy and present, not just a father who was afraid. He said holding on to the past might feel like protection, but it might actually be hurting Isabella by keeping her from having a relationship with her mom. I sat there in my car with tears running down my face, knowing he was right, but not knowing how to be brave enough to act on it. I spent the next few days trying not to obsess over what might happen at Isabella's next visit with her mother, but I kept catching myself checking the calendar and counting down the hours. The supervised visit was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Riverside Park, and when the day arrived, I drove Isabella there and watched her bounce in her car seat with excitement. She had on her favorite purple jacket and kept asking if Mommy would remember that purple was her favorite color now, and I told her yes, even though I didn't actually know. The social worker met us at the park entrance and gave me a reassuring nod before walking Isabella over to where my ex-wife was waiting by the playground. I stayed back near the parking lot like I was supposed to, close enough to see them, but far enough away that I wasn't hovering, and I watched my ex-wife kneel down to hug Isabella and saw the way Isabella's whole face lit up. They walked together to the swing set, and my ex-wife helped Isabella climb onto one of the swings, and then she started pushing her gently while Isabella kicked her legs and laughed. The sound of that laugh carried across the playground and hit me somewhere in my chest. This pure, happy sound that I heard every day at home, but somehow felt different watching it happen with her mother. They played on the swings for a while and then moved to the slide. And I could see my ex-wife talking to Isabella the whole time, really engaged and present in a way that made me remember how she used to be before everything went wrong. After about 40 minutes, the social worker walked over to where I was standing and commented that their relationship had really grown over the past year. She told me Isabella seemed completely comfortable and secure with her mother, and that the bond between them was clearly strong. I nodded and said something about that being good, but what I was really thinking was that I'd been so focused on protecting Isabella from potential harm that I hadn't noticed how much she genuinely enjoyed these visits. I'd been treating them like something to endure rather than something that brought her joy, and watching her now, I felt guilty for not seeing it sooner. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. My next therapy session with Petra was on Tuesday evening after I dropped Isabella at my brother's house for a few hours. I walked into her office feeling tired and confused, and when she asked how I was doing, I found myself telling her about the park visit and how happy Isabella had looked. Petra listened without interrupting, and then asked me to think about what exactly I was protecting Isabella from these days. She wanted me to explore whether I was protecting her from actual harm or protecting myself from the fear of being hurt again, and the question made me uncomfortable because I didn't want to admit what the answer might be. We talked for a while about how Isabella had become not just my daughter, but my entire identity over the past 5 years, and how the thought of sharing custody felt like losing myself rather than just losing time with her. Petra pointed out that I'd built my whole life around being Isabella's primary parent, and that changing that arrangement meant redefining who I was as a person. She asked me what would be left of me if I wasn't the dad who did everything, and I didn't have a good answer. The session lasted an hour, and when it was over, I sat in my car outside her office building and stared at the steering wheel. Everything she'd said made sense, but accepting it felt like admitting I'd been selfish, like all my protective instincts had really just been about my own needs instead of Isabella's safety. I drove to pick up Isabella from Evan's house, and she chattered the whole way home about the cookies they'd baked together, and I listened and smiled, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Lana called me the following week to schedule individual sessions with each of us, so we could discuss what custody changes we were actually looking for. I went to her office on a Thursday afternoon and sat in the same conference room where we'd had our joint mediation session. Lana explained that she wanted to understand each of our perspectives separately before we tried to negotiate together, and she asked me directly what kind of arrangement I thought would work best for Isabella. I started to say that the current setup was fine, but then I stopped myself and admitted I didn't actually know anymore. Lana nodded like she'd expected that answer and told me she'd met with my ex-wife the day before. She said my ex-wife had proposed a gradual transition rather than jumping straight to a 50-50 split, starting with one overnight visit per week and building from there based on how Isabella adjusted. I was surprised because I'd expected her to push for more time immediately, and Lana seemed to notice my reaction. She told me the proposal showed real thought about what would be best for Isabella rather than just what my ex-wife wanted, and that it demonstrated the kind of child-centered thinking that made successful co-parenting possible. I asked what would happen after the trial period, and Lana explained we'd reassess based on how everyone was adjusting, potentially adding more time if things went well. The whole conversation felt more reasonable than I'd expected, and I left her office feeling less defensive than when I'd arrived. That weekend, I decided I needed to actually talk to Isabella about all of this, instead of just making decisions for her. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and she was coloring a picture of a rainbow while I cleaned up the dishes. I sat down across from her and asked how she felt about spending more time with her mother, trying to keep my voice calm and neutral, even though my heart was racing. Isabella stopped coloring and looked up at me with those serious eyes that made her seem older than 5. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her thinking about how to answer. Finally, she said she loved Mommy and wished she could have sleepovers there like she did with me, the words coming out careful and measured. Then she asked if that would make me sad, and I felt something break open inside my chest. I realized in that moment that she'd been protecting my feelings the same way I'd been protecting her, both of us trying to shield each other from hurt. I told her it wouldn't make me sad and that I wanted her to spend time with her mother, but I could see in her face that she didn't quite believe me. We talked for a few more minutes, and she went back to coloring her rainbow, but the conversation stayed with me for days afterward. A week later, my ex-wife sent me a large envelope through Lana's office containing documentation of her stability for the mediation process. I opened it at my kitchen table after Isabella went to bed and spread out the papers in front of me. There were employment records showing 3 years of steady work at the dental office, therapy attendance logs with signatures from her therapist confirming weekly sessions, medication compliance reports from her psychiatrist, and letters from her treatment team talking about her progress and stability. I read through everything slowly, forcing myself to actually look at the evidence instead of just dismissing it. The paperwork showed consistent effort and real progress over years, not just a few months of good behavior. There were performance reviews from her job that described her as reliable and professional, notes from her therapist about the coping skills she'd developed, records of every single appointment she'd kept. Looking at all of it together, I was confronted with proof that she'd done the hard work of getting better and staying better, and I'd been trying not to see it, because seeing it meant acknowledging something difficult. It meant admitting that my reasons for wanting to keep the current custody arrangement were becoming more about my own fear than about Isabella's actual safety. The documentation sat on my table for 3 days before I finally put it back in the envelope, and even then, I couldn't stop thinking about what it meant. Evan came over for dinner the next Friday and brought pizza because he knew I'd been stressed and probably wasn't cooking much. Isabella was excited to see her uncle and immediately dragged him to her room to show him the elaborate block tower she'd been building. I heated up the pizza and set the table, and after we ate, Evan spent almost an hour playing with Isabella while I cleaned up the kitchen. He built towers with her blocks and let her win at the matching game, and listened to her explain the complex rules of a game she'd invented that made no sense to anyone but her. When Isabella finally went to take her bath, Evan came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. He told me Isabella seemed like a really happy kid who clearly felt secure and loved, and I nodded because I knew that was true. Then he said something that made me stop washing dishes and look at him. He pointed out that giving Isabella a relationship with her mother wouldn't erase the bond we'd built together, and that maybe I was strong enough as a father to share her without losing her. The words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt tears start to build behind my eyes. Evan gave me a hug and told me I was doing the right thing by even considering this, and then he left. After he was gone, I stood in my kitchen and cried, trying to be quiet so Isabella wouldn't hear me from the bathroom. The following Tuesday, there was another supervised visit, and I watched from my usual spot near the parking lot while Isabella played with her mother on the playground. At one point, Isabella ran over to the monkey bars and started telling her mother about how she'd been learning to ride a bike without training wheels. My ex-wife's whole face changed when Isabella said that, lighting up with this genuine interest and pride that made her look like the person I'd married years ago. She asked Isabella questions about the bike riding and listened carefully to the answers, and I could see her really engaging with our daughter's life instead of just going through the motions of a visit. When the visit ended and Isabella ran back to me, the social worker walked over and mentioned that my ex-wife had asked detailed questions about Isabella's progress and interests throughout their time together. She said it showed real engagement and attentiveness, and I nodded and said that was good. But what I was really feeling was guilty for being surprised by it, guilty for expecting less from her when she was clearly trying so hard. The next mediation session with Lana was scheduled for the following week, and I walked into that conference room feeling different from I had the first time. My ex-wife was already there, and we sat down across from each other at the small table. This time, when Lana asked us to discuss the custody arrangement, I found myself actually listening to my ex-wife instead of just waiting for my turn to list concerns. I heard someone who loved Isabella just as much as I did, someone who'd been through something terrible and come out the other side. She talked about the harm her illness had caused and acknowledged the fear she knew I carried, and she didn't ask me to forget any of it. She just asked me to consider that people can heal and change, that the person she was 5 years ago wasn't the person sitting across from me now. As she talked, I realized she was asking for the same thing I would want if our positions were reversed, the same grace and second chance I'd hope someone would give me. The session lasted almost 2 hours, and by the end of it, we'd actually had a conversation, instead of just 2 separate speeches. During that same session, Lana proposed a specific trial period, where Isabella would have 1 overnight visit per week with her mother. She explained we'd try it for 2 months, and then reassess based on how everyone was adjusting, and that we could modify the arrangement if needed. The proposal felt reasonable and careful, designed to give Isabella time to adapt without overwhelming her. I looked at my ex-wife, and saw her waiting for my answer, and I could see how much this meant to her. I took a deep breath and told Lana I agreed to the trial period, and my ex-wife's eyes immediately filled with tears. She thanked me, and her voice broke on the words, and I felt terrified and hopeful at the same time. We spent the rest of the session working out logistics, like which night would work best and how we'd handle the transition, and by the time I left, I was shaking, but also felt like maybe I'd done the right thing. The first overnight visit was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and as the date got closer, I became more and more anxious. I triple-checked that my ex-wife had Isabella's favorite stuffed animal and knew her complete bedtime routine, texting her reminders about how Isabella liked her nightlight positioned and what songs she preferred before sleep. My ex-wife responded patiently to every message, reassuring me that she had everything under control. When the day finally arrived, I packed Isabella's overnight bag with her pajamas and toothbrush and the stuffed elephant she couldn't sleep without. Isabella was bouncing around the apartment with excitement and nervousness, asking questions about what Mommy's apartment looked like and whether they'd make breakfast together in the morning. We drove to my ex-wife's place across town, and I walked Isabella up to the door, carrying her bag and trying to keep my anxiety from showing on my face. My ex-wife answered the door with a smile and invited us in to see Isabella's room, and I followed them inside, even though I hadn't planned to. The apartment was small but clean and welcoming, and Isabella's room had a twin bed with purple sheets and some toys already arranged on a shelf. Isabella hugged me tight before I left and asked if I'd be okay without her, and I promised her I would be, even though I wasn't sure that was true. I drove back to my apartment and sat on the couch in the dark living room with my phone in my hand. The screen stayed blank for the first hour, and I kept checking to make sure the volume was turned up all the way. Isabella had never spent a night away from me before, and the apartment felt too quiet in a way that made my chest tight. I got up and checked her room twice, even though I knew she wasn't there, looking at her empty bed with the purple comforter and the stuffed animals lined up against the pillow. Around 8 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed, and I grabbed it so fast I almost dropped it. My ex-wife had sent a photo of Isabella sitting on a couch in pajamas with a book open on her lap, both of them smiling at the camera. The text said they were reading bedtime stories, and Isabella had picked out 3 books. I stared at the photo for a long time, and they both looked genuinely happy in a way that made me feel relieved, and also like I was losing something I couldn't name. I texted back that it looked like they were having fun, and then I sat on the couch holding the phone for another hour before I finally went to bed. I barely slept that night, waking up every hour to check my phone even though I knew nothing was wrong. When I picked Isabella up the next morning, she ran to the door talking before I even got inside. She told me about making pancakes with Mommy and how they played 3 board games and watched a movie with popcorn. She talked the whole drive home about every single thing they did, and she seemed perfectly fine, maybe even happier than usual, which was both exactly what I'd hoped for and also a strange kind of loss that I didn't know how to process. The weekly overnights became routine faster than I expected. Every Friday evening I drove Isabella across town with her overnight bag, and every Saturday morning I picked her up and listened to her stories about what they'd done. My ex-wife started texting me during the week about small things like what snacks Isabella liked now or whether she'd outgrown her winter coat. I found myself responding with actual information instead of just short answers. We talked about Isabella's upcoming parent-teacher conference and decided to both attend, sitting in those tiny chairs in her classroom while her teacher showed us her artwork and reading progress. Isabella beamed at having both of us there, and afterward my ex-wife asked if I wanted to grab coffee to discuss what the teacher had said. We sat in a coffee shop for 40 minutes, talking about Isabella's strengths and areas where she needed help, and it felt almost normal in a way I hadn't expected. 2 months went by like that, settling into a rhythm that started to feel less scary and more like just how things were. Isabella thrived with the expanded time with her mother, and I noticed she seemed more secure rather than less, as if having both parents actively involved made her world feel bigger and safer instead of divided. At the reassessment meeting with Lana, we all sat around the same conference table, and Lana asked how everyone felt about the arrangement. My ex-wife said it had been wonderful, and Isabella was adjusting beautifully. I admitted that it had gone better than I'd feared, and that Isabella seemed happy. Lana smiled and said that was exactly what she'd hoped to hear. We agreed to continue the current arrangement, and Lana suggested possibly adding a second overnight in 6 months if things kept going well. My ex-wife nodded and thanked us both, and I realized I wasn't scared anymore, just cautiously hopeful about what came next. One evening, about a week later, Isabella was sitting at the kitchen table with her crayons and construction paper while I made dinner. She worked quietly for a while, and then called me over to see what she'd made. I walked to the table and looked down at the drawing, and my breath caught. She'd drawn 3 stick figures holding hands, her in the middle with me on one side and her mother on the other. She'd written, "My family," across the top in her wobbly letters and colored each figure carefully. She looked up at me with those serious eyes and told me it was her whole family, all of us together. I picked up the drawing and studied it, and even though it looked different from the family I'd imagined when she was born 5 years ago, I realized it was the family she needed. Maybe that's what being a good father actually means. Not protecting her from everything, but giving her room to love and be loved by everyone who cares for her. I taped the drawing to the refrigerator right next to the old one of just the 2 of us, and Isabella smiled and went back to coloring another picture. I stood there looking at both drawings for a long time, the old family and the new one, and felt something settle in my chest that had been tight for years. Well, that happened. If you're still watching, congratulations on your life choices. Stick around, it probably gets worse.